I can't emphasize enough how important language is. It's one thing to be able to understand somebody in a secondary language, right? And there was the famous quote by Nelson Mandela, right? That if you speak to someone in their second language, you speak to their mind. But if you speak to them in their mother tongue, you speak to their heart. I've seen this play out in so many different contexts, in so many different places. And it's especially true here. And so I really think that anybody who cares about this, that lives in the region, and they don't speak Arabic, they need to speak Arabic. If they don't speak Hebrew, they should learn Hebrew.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Yasmine Mohammed podcast. Today, we have a guest named Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu is a content creator and a digital educator specializing in Jewish diversity, history, and identity. You might know him on Instagram as that_Semite. He's got a very popular page where he speaks with people from all across. So he's a fluent English speaker, Arabic speaker, and Hebrew speaker. So he is loved by people from all the communities in Israel. His family has actually been in Israel for 9 generations. So his existence alone counters the narrative that Jews are colonizers to the land of Israel. His roots in the old Yishuv and the Caribbean inform his social media activism, where he uses English, Hebrew, and Arabic to reach diverse audiences. Inspired by the lives of his ancestors, those who lived in the old city of Jerusalem for generations, and those who survived the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. So wow, across the planet. Yirmiyahu is a dedicated educator activist. He lectures Israeli and diaspora audiences on Jewish identity, diversity, and anti-Semitism. He also founded, now I'm not sure how to pronounce this, I should have asked you, I had in my head to ask you and I forgot. Shachar?
Shachar.
Shachar, a community for Caribbean, African American, and West African Israeli Jews. Welcome, welcome, Yirmiyahu. I'm very, very honored to have you with me here today.
Thank you so much for having me. The honor is mutual.
Now, we met together when we were in Israel really briefly, and I just knew immediately, I'm like, oh, this is a man that I have to have on my podcast. And I'm glad that we finally made it happen. So let's start off with your family. So your family has been in Israel for 9 generations. Can you tell us all about that and about your Caribbean ancestry and everything and how you ended up in Israel today?
Of course. First of all, it was such a joy to meet you accidentally. I wasn't intending on being at that really unique event in Jerusalem where there's all these different representatives from all over the Arab and the Islamic world. And I met you, and I had the same exact reaction, like, "Oh, this is the woman I'd like to speak to more." So I'm so happy that you invited me here, and I'm happy to continue this conversation that we started in Jerusalem not too long ago. But so the story of my family. Well, certainly, as you can tell with the bio, right, there's two very clear branches there. One is the Caribbean side, that's my mother's side. And I don't know if we're going to be speaking a lot about that today. I mean, maybe if we have time later. But a lot of people don't know when they hear about my mother being a Jewish Caribbean woman that there are Jews in the Caribbean. And it's absolutely true. Jews have been in the Caribbean as long as Jews have been in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, the first Jews to arrive in the Western Hemisphere were Jews fleeing the Spanish Inquisition from Iberia, and they arrived in places like the Guyanas on the coast of South America, like Jamaica, like Trinidad. And so I do a lot of teaching about the experiences of Jews in the Caribbean, of Jews in the African American experience, and also West Africa. And there's a lot of linkages between all three of those communities. So on my father's side, that's where we've been in the land of Israel for 9 generations. My father was born in the land of Israel, and as far as they could count, they were at least 7 generations in Jerusalem. And before that, they know that they were also in Safed or Tzfat, as we pronounce it in Hebrew. And they were a part of a community known as the Old Yishuv. Now, Old Yishuv is juxtaposed to New Yishuv, and New Yishuv is what the Jewish community was called after the beginning of the modern Zionist movement. So when the World Zionist Organization and various different groups with the purpose of politically organizing the movement for Jewish self-determination and sovereignty in the ancestral homeland of Jewish people happened, that community started being known as the new Yishuv. Everything that existed before then was the old Yishuv. And Jews have lived in the land of Israel continuously for thousands of years. A lot of people, then they tell the story of the Jewish people, or they tell the story of Israel-Palestine, they say, okay, there was a Jewish kingdom here once upon a time, if they admit that. And then because of various wars, particularly a clash between the Jewish people and the Roman Empire, the Jews were sent into exile. And that was true for many Jews, but it wasn't true for the majority of Jews. And there continued to be a strong Jewish presence in the land of Israel, really, possibly even constituting a sizable portion of the population, if not a majority, until the Islamic Arab conquest in the 7th century. And that's when we start to see the numbers start to significantly shift because of process of Arabization and a lot of other different factors. But even during that period when the Jewish population dropped down to tens of thousands, there was always a community there. And my family was a part of that community. So my great-grandfather, he was born in the old city of Jerusalem, and he was a part of what was then Ottoman-occupied Palestine. So he spoke Turkish when he had to with the Ottoman authorities, but at the home they spoke Palestinian Arabic, or what we call today Palestinian Arabic. They spoke a dialect of Hebrew. They spoke a dialect of Yiddish, known as Palestinian Yiddish, which no longer exists anymore. And that was the culture milieu in which they lived. And so he lived to see the land being conquered from one empire to the other, that transition period from the Ottoman Empire control to the British Empire control. And what, like the vast majority of the Jews of the old Yishuv, they joined the Zionist movement because they saw it as, quite frankly, the modern Zionist movement, because the focus being on the term Zion, all Jews, wherever they were in the diaspora, before the modern political movement, and including the Jews that never left the land or Jews that were part of that land and they continue to return in waves nonstop since the initial exile, they all had this yearning of a return to Jewish self-determination, to sovereignty, even if they didn't use those terms to describe it, and even if they didn't have the tools. A lot of people don't know that there were other attempts before modern Zionism to reestablish Jewish sovereignty in the land. In the 1500s, there was a big movement of Sephardic Jews trying to reestablish autonomy in the northern part of the land. It didn't succeed for various reasons. Even in the beginning of the Arab conquest during the 8th century, if I'm not mistaken, there was a movement led by a Jew who I happen to share a name with him, Yahya ben Yirmiyahu, who actually led a movement against the Arab occupation in order to try and reestablish Jewish rule. It was also put down. And so when the modern Zionist movement started having success, with the return of Jews from different parts of the diaspora, including from Yemen and Poland and Russia, as people are familiar with, right? My grandfather or my great-grandfather, they joined that movement because they saw it as a means for auto-emancipation, for liberation in the land. But at the same time, they were very much a part of the cultural and, identity, milieu that existed in that period, in that land during that period. So it was very normal for me growing up not only to hear my grandfather and my other relatives identify as Palestinian Jews, I also saw how much they really got on and felt comfortable with Palestinian Arabs. When I would come to visit my grandparents that were here in this land, because I was living in the United States, the places where my grandfather felt the most comfortable were in Arab restaurants, speaking in Arabic, being in that cultural environment. That was home to him. And so for me, when I was looking for my sense of identity, right, as somebody that was, wearing this backpack where I had this very clear, strong sense of Israeliness, this very clear, strong sense of Jewishness, this very clear sense of Caribbeanness in the United States, I also had this kind of Palestinian identity that I was carrying with me. And so when I went to university in the US, and I went to a campus where there was no Israelis. I couldn't find any Israeli community there. It felt really natural for me to go to the Al-Aqsa Cafe. And that's where I went. And so I went to Al-Aqsa Cafe and immediately I walked in, they knew I was Israeli. They just had a feeling. But immediately we struck off a super strong relationship. And some of my best friends while I was at university in the States were Palestinians. And we support each other in various different ways. And we talked about everything, including politics. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if I'd be able to do that right now, the environment in the US. But for me, it was very clear that my very strong, unapologetic Jewish Israeli identity doesn't necessarily contradict with an appreciation and a love for Palestinian Arab identity. And this is something that's really driven me as I started getting more involved in social activism, in politics, in education. And it's a big part of what I do today.
Fascinating. Yes, it is a very big part of what you do today. And like I was saying, when you go around and you have these conversations, it is very clear, like your heart is on your sleeve. You know, people can tell right away when they meet you that you're coming from a pure and honest place where you have empathy for everyone who you're speaking to, and you have nuance in your conversations. I think that's what's really missing from most of the conversations that are being had today. It's very us and them, you know, this team versus that team. And it's very difficult to try and have conversations in between such extremist rhetoric, because it's like both sides feel that you're betraying them. You know, both sides want you to be on an extreme, like choose a team kind of thing. And it's refreshing. It's beautiful. It's, you know, keeps your faith in humanity, watching your interviews and seeing you navigate that space so effortlessly. I know that it gives me a lot of hope, and I know it gives most of probably all your listeners the same kind of hope in this polarized world that we're living in. So before we talk more about these interviews that you do, which we will get into in more detail, let's talk a little bit about your mom's background, because, you know, we talk about Ashkenazi Jews, of course, a lot being from, you know, English-speaking West. We're very familiar, well, more familiar with the Ashkenazi experience. And somewhat getting more and more familiar with the Sephardic or Mizrahi experience. Tell us about a Jewish Caribbean person. Tell us about that experience.
Absolutely. So I'm really glad you asked that, because a lot of people, you know, they acknowledge, all right, so sure, there are Jews in different parts of Africa, there are Jews in the Caribbean, there are Jews in Latin America, but they don't really get into the nitty-gritty details of it. And so I'm glad you're asking that question, because the story of Caribbean Jewry and the story of, I would say, Jews of color in the West is one that is incredibly inspiring, in my opinion. The beginnings of Jewish communities, both in North America, South America, and the Caribbean, were Sephardic Jews that were known as the Hebrew nation of the New World. That's how the Spanish referred to them. And so they left the Iberian Peninsula in one of the darkest chapters of Jewish history, and that was during the Spanish Inquisition, the Alhambra decree, when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella issued a decree expelling the Jewish people from Spain, and then later the King of Portugal followed suit. And so this happened in 1492, right? As people know, 1492, that's also when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And so many Jews, while they were also going from what we call Hebrew Sfarad, from Iberia to North Africa, to the land of Israel, right? Like I said, there was always the waves of Jews returning to the land of Israel, and to the Balkans. There were also Jews that went on the ships that were sailing west. And so some of the first Jewish communities, or say certainly the first Jewish communities in the Western Hemisphere, were created by these Jews that were coming off of ships as a part of this, unfortunately, colonizing campaign that the Spaniards were involved in, but also, first and foremost, seeking refuge. And so Jews settled in places like Jamaica, like Suriname, like Guyana, like Curacao, and they reconstituted themselves as Jewish communities there. And they dealt with anti-Semitism, just like Jews dealt with anti-Semitism in different places. They dealt with certain degrees of freedom, depending on what was going on in terms of the government. And those Jews, just like Jews everywhere, in order to survive and maintain, they also married and mixed in with the local population, just like every community does. And so that's why, unfortunately, when people see Jews from the Caribbean and they see somebody that looks, by their estimation, black or brown, they're surprised. Like they're expecting somebody to look like they just stepped out of Iberia yesterday. But the reality is this is the truth of every Jewish community, is that we tend to, so while some of us might look like we stepped out of Levant yesterday, others look like our neighbors in the places that we lived, and like our neighbors in the host countries. And so the vast majority of Caribbean Jews today, of African American Jews today, which have a similar history, are people of color. And so my mother is a person of color. And as a result of that, growing up in America because my mom comes from this Caribbean background. My father comes from the land of Israel. They met in the only place where a Caribbean person and an Israeli person can meet, and that's New York City. Now I'd probably say maybe Miami as well. So I had this, this dual identity of the Middle East, but also the Caribbean. And I think there's a lot of crossovers too. One of the things I think is so beautiful about both Middle Eastern and Caribbean culture is this, we call it in Jewish culture chutzpah, right? This the audacity to express yourself without any apology.
Yeah, you definitely got that in droves. So I guess you got it from both sides.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to ask you about Ethiopian Jews. I know that this isn't something I brought up to you before or anything that you've mentioned, but I've always been curious about that experience, and you all seem to know everything about everything. So can you explain to me that whole history?
Sure. So first of all, when we talk about the history of Jewish diaspora, right, we have to keep in mind that there were multiple attempts of empires to destroy the Hebrew or the Israelite Commonwealth that existed in what we call today Israel-Palestine. Before the Romans smashed Judea, which is why the vast majority of Jews around the world identify as Jews, is because we come from Judea. We come from that Judean kingdom that was destroyed by the Romans. Before that happened, hundreds of years before that happened, previous empires, the Assyrian and then the Babylonian, invaded the land of Israel during that first commonwealth. So typically we chop up Jewish history now into three Jewish commonwealths. The first one being the Hebrew kingdom that was established by King David and King Solomon. After that, the kingdom of Judea that was reestablished by the Maccabees, hence Hanukkah. That's what we celebrate then. And now this third one, which is the modern state of Israel. So when the first Hebrew Commonwealth was destroyed by the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, that sent 10 tribes into different places. And so while the majority of Jews today, whether they are identified as Ashkenazim or Sephardic or Mizrahi, the majority of them trace their roots to that second Commonwealth, right? With exceptions. The Ethiopian Jews and also communities like the Bene Israel that lived in India and a few other communities, they trace themselves to that first Commonwealth. And so as a result of that, Ethiopian Jewry, or more correctly, as they refer to themselves, Beta Israel, the House of Israel, they trace their origins to that first Commonwealth. And so as a result, they were more isolated from other communities. And so the Jewish culture or the Hebrew culture that they practiced reflected that separation, reflected that earlier period in Israelite history. And during the 1800s, when Jews, as a result of new technologies for travel, started going out into these different places and being able to communicate with each other in a more effective manner, that's when these connections between, say, Jews that were in Ashkenaz, in Europe, or Sephardic Jews and Mizrahi Jews with those communities in places like India and Ethiopia and other places of Africa, that's when they started becoming stronger. When it went from being a myth, like, oh, we think we heard about there being some Jewish communities all the way over there, then it became a reality. And that's when the movement for basically, number one, having a relationship between these communities started, but also with the founding of the Zionist movement, also a movement to help those Jews do what they were always trying to do, which was to return to Israel. And just to make it very concrete for people, right? And so people understand that irrespective of what was happening with the modern political Zionist movement, there were always different communities that were trying to return back to the land. In 1862, if I'm not mistaken, there was a movement led by Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews, not knowing what was going on with any other communities. They were like, we are going to return in a mass return to the land of Israel. And they did. They left their villages en masse and started marching towards the Sudan to try and get the land of Israel. For various reasons, it failed. But just imagine if they had succeeded, if that was the first group to return to the land and to start a movement to politically rebuild in Palestine, how different history might have been, right? Mm-hmm. But frankly, I mean, maybe we'll talk about this later. I don't think it would have been so different.
Fascinating. It's really fascinating how the diaspora was like spread, like Jewish people spread all over the planet for generations, yet still the differences between like an Ethiopian Jew and an Iranian Jew, it's still slight differences, like you'd expect it to be much greater, especially if we're talking about Iranian Jews who had to keep their identity hidden for so long. But they somehow kept it hidden and they secretly passed it on to their kids somehow. It was very dangerous. And it was, it wasn't only Iran. There was many places around the world where that was the truth, but they still somehow managed to hold on to their roots and to remember who they were, despite having to put on an outward persona for survival. Fascinating, really, really fascinating history. And we could have
It's
a whole
it's one of
podcast
the
on just that.
Absolutely. It's one of the mysteries of history.
Hmm.
Historians, whether they come from the discipline of Jewish studies or not, are just breaking their heads over this question. How is it possible that this tiny ethno-religious group from the Levant that starts in the Bronze Age is able to survive exile and displacement from their homeland in all these different cultural contexts? It's so improbable, yet for various reasons, a minority. It's important for people to understand in every single place the Jews went in the diaspora, the majority of people assimilated because it was just so difficult to hold on to the identity. But a tiny minority in each of these places, whether it was in Central Europe or in Iran or in India or the Americas, a tiny group held on, and these tiny groups that held on to this story of perpetual refugee status, they were the ones to return to the land of Israel and constitute what is today known as Israelis and the Jewish people all over the world.
You yourself are an example of that. I mean, you're Israeli, but you're Caribbean, but you're American. You could have easily chosen to identify more with another part of yourself and to really not, be such a strong Israeli man sitting in front of me today. You could have been like, my family's from Israel, but I don't really, whatever, I'm American, or whatever the case. You could have chosen that as well, right? And I'm sure lots of people did just for whatever, who they ended up marrying or for ease. It's the path of least resistance, especially times like this when anti-Semitism is looming so large. I can imagine that there's a lot of people that just choose to not put that part of their identity front and center, and then it gets lost with their kids.
And unfortunately, we see it happens in such great numbers everywhere, and it's happening in huge numbers right now in North America. It's really stark, right? We're seeing how a demographic shift from before the Holocaust, where the vast majority of Jews are during that period are living in Europe, and very few Jews are living in the land of Israel, where now it's flipped, right? Where there's basically no Jews left in Europe, and now the biggest Jewish community in the world is in Israel. And with the numbers and the rates of assimilation in North America, that's only going to become starker. And so we're
Yeah.
going to see that the vast majority of Jews by the turn of the century are going to be living in the land of Israel.
Yeah, I have no doubt from what's happening in Canada and America right now, well, at least in North America for sure. Europe, as you said, that trend's already started. But I think American Jews for a long time have really felt like, it's a thing of the past, like we've so moved forward. Anti-Semitism is so behind us. And now they're starting to realize, it's sad, it's shocking, it's scary. But they're starting to realize that, oh gosh, no, I was very wrong to think that. It has reared its ugly head. It was always there, but it was just hidden, and now it is hidden no more. So you're right in the eye of the storm. I mean, we know this is all happening in Australia, Canada, all across Europe, America, Britain, everywhere, right? But you are literally in the eye of the storm there, living in Israel. You are interviewing, like I mentioned, Palestinian people, Arab people, Christian Palestinians as well, like all across the board. Um, what I'd like to know from you, from all of these people, because you're so uniquely positioned to do these street interviews that you do because of the fact that you speak English, Arabic, and Hebrew so fluently. Um, what I'd like to know from you is It's a big question. What do you see as the way forward from this point? Like what will it take after October 7th? Is there hope that Israelis will ever trust Palestinians again? Um, and if so, what do you think it will take for that to happen? And vice versa. What will it take for people to start trusting each other again?
So I'll start off with the hope because I do have hope. What gives me hope is that when I go out and I have these conversations with people on the street, and just so people know, like I don't just go to Israeli cities, I go to Palestinian cities as well and Palestinian villages. Before the war started, I used to go to refugee camps and speak with the people there. I've been very blessed that over my many years in this field to have developed very deep and meaningful relationships with people across the political, ethnic, and religious spectrum, from the river to the sea.
Yeah.
And, you know, in doing so, I've met so many people that are so disillusioned by this ongoing pattern or cycle, however you want to define it, of violence, of denial, of rejection, of terror, of war. And within that group, which I know is growing, I believe that there is so much potential for a revolution in the way that we see each other and the revolution, the way that we relate to each other in this land. And I think that there, even if there isn't a path now, and I agree, there is not a path right now to truth, peace, and reconciliation, right, and justice. But I think that if there is one to be made, it's through those people coming together and being able to articulate a new voice, a new message. And I see it; it's bubbling. But we just need the coordination. We need the communication between the sides that doesn't exist right now. Now, unfortunately, that communication almost doesn't exist. And what we've seen now is unbelievable levels of, number one, on the Palestinian side, a rejection of the right of the Jewish people to even be here, period. Rejection of Jewish history, things that didn't exist in the past, right? It's really alarming to see that Hajj Amina Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem in the 20s, who was also a Nazi/Nazi collaborator, he was more open and truthful about the relationship of the Jews to the land than the current Mufti of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
That is a very stark reality. And it's created one, which on the Israeli side, I think we have unprecedented levels of lack of desire to compromise with Palestinians, a lack of a desire to trust Palestinians. And I think that is then leading to even more stark things that we're seeing on the extreme side of the Israeli spectrum, which is the denial of the existence of Palestinians. And in that type of environment, it makes it so difficult for us to talk about any solution, right? And so that's why I think we need to really invest in education, but education through this vehicle of dialogue, of a real project of bringing the two publics together so that they can actually meet each other to hear the narratives that they have for themselves as peoples, but also the narratives they have for the other and see where they're not really congruent and then fact check them, right? Because there's this complete, lack of desire to actually look at history and look at science and look at anthropology, right? Because if we had like this ability to actually speak to each other in a language of truth, I think justice would be a lot more attainable.
So here's the problem. So my dad grew up in Gaza back in the day when Israelis would go there to hang out on the beach, and there was Jewish people living in Gaza. It was like a very different time than it is now. So my grandfather would actually say things like, there's Palestinian Jews and there's Palestinian Arabs. And I'm like, okay, people don't say things like that anymore, right? But they really did have this, they wanted their ancestral homeland to be independent, of course. They had political issues, but neither my grandfather, my grandmother, we never really talked about it, or my dad had anti-Semitism in the way that is so common in the Arab world today. And I always felt like part of the reason why my dad's generation wasn't so viciously, genocidally anti-Semitic was because he knew Jewish people. They knew Jewish people growing up. They interacted with them. They worked with them. They lived with them. Whereas the people today, now what my mom is from Egypt, so I'm talking about the anti-Semitism from Egypt as well. Just shocking, just shocking levels of like Soviet level craziness when it comes to their anti-Semitism. They've never met a Jewish person in their life, right? And so it's so easy for them to create this boogeyman. So what you're dealing with in Gaza is a similar situation. You've got some people were going into Israel and working, but the vast majority were getting indoctrinated in these UNRWA schools, right? They've got their puppets, they've got their store that's called Hitler, they've got their mannequins that have like knives taped to their hands. They've got their kids' play in school was about stabbing Jews. Like it's just like another level of indoctrination. And I don't know how you can meet somebody like that and then try to start to have the conversation. Like it feels like it feels like such a impossible task from my point of view. I was indoctrinated, and so I understand how it like possesses your mind. And if anybody tried to talk to me in those days when I was still indoctrinated, you're like a cyborg. And I'm sure you've seen this in your conversations. You probably could have a bingo card, right? You just know what response is going to come, right? You say something, you know what's going to come back at you because we're all the same software has been input into all of us. And I find it like not worth my time, not worth my energy. I don't have the empathy that you do or the humanity or the patience, you know. I've seen too much. I know too much. Like I can't bring myself to even bother. Now I know a lot of Palestinian people and a lot of Gazan people who are not indoctrinated, right? So they've got their grievances, they've got their issues. They are truly sometimes, they have political issues, and it's not bigotry against Jewish people. And those are people you can have conversations with. Those are people I'm happy to speak with, and you get into the nuance and the details and stuff like that. But I don't know how we can get through to what is, unfortunately, you and I both know, the majority are just, their brains are completely shut down and not ready for this conversation. On the Israeli side, I can see, and I've always known, and even my Israeli friends, they would say to me that I was being too harsh. That, and again, like I said, I know too much. This is pre-October 7th, right? I was married to a member of Al-Qaeda. Like I understand jihadis. I understand the ideology of Islamists. And so, when you got your average, Israeli Canadian person, they're like, oh, Yasmine, come on, chill out. It's not so bad. Palestinians work in our homes and, it's all cool. After October 7th, it has completely changed. Now they know as much as I do, which is heartbreaking, because I'm like, now, like ignorance is bliss to a certain extent. Like, I feel bad that they have to know how bad it is, but they don't speak that way anymore. Like now they are currently in trauma. We have to remember that the hostages are still in Gaza. Like we're still dealing with this. This is still current. We're not talking about something past. So to try and have truth and reconciliation while something is still brewing is absolutely ridiculous, and unfair and inhumane to Jewish people. But I can sort of understand where they're coming from right now when they're like, nope, we're not trusting anybody. Absolutely not. Like they're still bleeding from October 7th. So I can imagine that conversation will change again through time, through healing, right? But the indoctrinated people with their minds completely possessed with this ideology, that one, I don't know how that changes over time unless you completely can somehow eradicate the indoctrination that is continuing, right? Stop it from continuing. But the ones that are already possessed, what do you do?
So I want to set aside for a second the kind of the realpolitik and the details of what's going on with the conflict in Gaza. We can come back to it, but what I want to do first is kind of take a few steps back. One of the things that a lot of people see in my interactions with Palestinians is that what I got from my grandfather wasn't just an empathy and a sympathy; it was also an intimate acquaintance with the culture. And on the other side of my family, even the Caribbean, a lot of people don't know there's a huge Muslim population in the Caribbean. I was intimately familiar with Islam. I went to masjids. I went to mosques growing up. Just because that's what the Caribbean was like. Everybody was mixing around and learning each other's culture and identity. And so as a result of that, I got to see the Arab Palestinian culture from up close and personal, including its Islamic expression, and also the way that Islam expresses itself in different parts of the world. And what I got both in that real life education, but also in academic education later, is an understanding that I think many people, if not most people in the West, do not have. Most Westerners, in particular Americans, they look at Middle Easterners like noble savages, right?
Yeah.
This people with no agency, that are basically just victims. And while that's reductionist and ridiculous and racist when you do it to any people, it's particularly ridiculous when you do it to the Middle East, which for most of history was the seat of the other competing empire in the world. And that's when, if you don't understand the dynamics of Islamism, of jihadism, and the history of conquest, colonization, and Arabization, and you try and put the tools that you then use to understand Western colonization to what's going on here in the dynamics between two Middle Eastern Semitic peoples, you completely miss the mark. And that's what we're seeing all over the place right now. And so when the Zionist movement was coming to head and it was on its way for a collision course with pan-Arabism, with what was then Palestinian Arab nationalism, that was what we were dealing with. And so the vast majority of the people that were articulating an anti-Zionist position from within the Palestinian Arabic society during that early period, they were doing so in the name of pan-Arabism, in the name of an Islamic caliphate that they wanted to rebuild on the ashes of the Ottoman Islamic caliphate that just ended. If anybody doesn't believe that, just look at the response of the Arab High Committee to the Peel Commission, the first opportunity to actually have a compromise to split the land in some type of way between Jews and Arabs. The response that the Arab High Committee gave to them, that the Supreme Muslim Council gave to them, was that no, we will not accept this because Palestine is not just for the Palestinian Arabs to give up, because it's part of the broader Arab nation and the Islamic world, right? And so the issue at that point was not just about dispute over land. It wasn't just a dispute over territory and resources. It was also the dynamic between who was then the hegemon of the region, the dominant ethno-religious group, and a group which was considered for centuries Ahl Dimma, right? Dhimmi, second class protected citizens. There's a whole debate about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm going to tell you right now, from our perspective, it was not a good thing, right? We were always vulnerable. We had to pay excessive taxes. So we could go on a whole list of things that were done to humiliate Jews and Christians in that position. And the idea that we would be daring to say, hey, no more empires. Now we're going to have self-determination. You can have it too, but we want it as well. And one of the things that was happening in the consciousness of that period was that if the Jews do it, what's going to stop the Assyrians from doing it in Iraq? What's going to stop the Copts from doing it in Egypt? So on and so forth, right? And so that was the dialectic in which this was happening. And so many of the early Palestinian Arab anti-Zionists, they were like, okay, yes, there are Palestinian Jews, and we're okay with that as long as they remain exactly that, Palestinian Jews within an Arab Islamic dominated society. And so as Jews have reestablished our state, the problem is that instead of us continuing a dialogue from a place of power, of parity, what happens is that the Palestinian Arabs, as we know, have been relegated to a deplorable state by not just the Arab nations, not just the Palestinian Arab leadership, but also by the Israelis. We can get into where all the blame has to be put around. But in that position, there has not only been the dispossessing of Palestinians, but also a complete lack of communication. So in that vacuum has all of this radical Islamic, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic fusion hatred. And that has just gotten worse and worse and worse with the years, to the point where everybody was recognizing that Jews are from this land and that Jews had the right to even be there and live there as equals. Now, Jews were never from here. Not only that, we're not even really Jews, right? There are a majority of people who say like, oh, you're all Europeans, Khazarian converts. There was no temple on the Temple Mount, right? These are all things that Hajj Amina Hosseini, I want to reiterate, somebody who was a Nazi would have laughed at. he was very open. He said, yes, this is where Solomon's temple was. Yes, the Jews were here. But you know what Haj Amin also said to the, I believe it was the British High Commissioner of Palestine? He said, two races cannot coexist here. The Jews left Palestine 2,000 years ago. Let them go somewhere else. And that rejectionism, that anti-Semitism has just been allowed to flourish. And in that wake of complete lack of dialogue, the Orientalism and the racism that did exist all the way back then on the Zionist, on the Jewish side, has just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's being expressed in a complete denial of the other, and a zero-sum game. And this is basically the painful reality that we're in. So before I keep talking, because I could talk about this subject for a while, maybe we want to go a different direction in terms of returning back to the current political reality with Gaza.
Yeah, I don't know how much I want to get into that, but how much do you want to get into it, Yirmiyahu?
Look, I'll say this. The Gazan Palestinian population is the most abused Palestinian population on the planet. They have been living in dilapidated conditions, in the type of situation that can be described as nothing more than a pressure cooker for hatred, for physical ailments, for all different types of things that I don't wish it on my worst enemy. And here, where they are, unfortunately, my worst enemy, Hamas, they have used that and they've turned it into the worst cesspool of hatred, of suffering. And so I think that this should just be a symbol for all of us, that this is what happens when we fail to understand what type of processes could actually lead to dialogue, to peace, to truth, to reconciliation. What we did in creating Gaza, because it was a joint effort, right? Gaza couldn't have been created without certain Israeli decision makers participating in that process, right? So what we created with Gaza, we, the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Americans, the Europeans, we cannot do that again. It's not good for Israelis. It's definitely not good for Palestinians.
So now my natural next question is, looking at what the mistakes that were done in the past, how can we move forward with Gaza? What can Gaza look like the day after this war ends and the hostages come home?
It's very difficult to tell from this point of view. I think from this vantage point, it's hard for us to imagine anything with Hamas still in some type of control. At the same time, the more you do to destroy Hamas, the more you do to create resentment among the Palestinian population. That being said, looking at history, I don't see what the alternative is. If we look at the Allied war against the Japanese Empire, against the Nazis in Germany. But I think that it's very important for the more that Israelis get involved in the Gaza Strip, we have to be also involved with the Palestinian people, with the Gazan population. And that has to be done by people that genuinely care for Palestinians. Because a part of my, in addition to, me having this cultural familiarity with Palestinian culture, I also have a great deal of love for Palestinians. They truly are my cousins in every way, in every meaning of that term. I see so much in common. Aside from just us coming from a similar Palestinian, Jewish, Arab cultural context, just as Jews and as Arabs, as Jews as Muslims, as Jews as Christians, we have so much in common. And so I think that people that are really speak the language, not just Arabic, but actually speak the language of the region, that really want to see some type of Semitic alliance that Ben Gurion used to talk about, they need to be the ones that are involved on the ground. Maybe different actors from moderates within the Arab world need to be involved in that too. But I think there is potential here. But we have to understand that as much as there is potential, we've been put back so many different steps on the path towards peace, because the blood and the carnage is not going to be wiped away easily.
Yes, that's true. And even if we are miraculously able to wipe out all the Hamas members in Gaza, of course, as you know, they're in Iran as well. They're in Lebanon. They're in Qatar. And it's not just Hamas. It's the Islamic regime of Iran who are funding Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. And this is a a multi-pronged hydra, with many, many heads. And yeah, it is a big problem. And it is something that we have no choice but to keep moving forward. We unfortunately lost a lot of these peace-loving Israelis that you're mentioning on October 7th. And so that also causes, an even bigger rift in this conversation going forward, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and for those who aren't familiar with my work, I also speak to extremists on the Jewish side of the spectrum. I do engage people with the most reprehensible ideas
Yeah.
within Israeli Jewish society, in with the purpose of trying to show them that this is not the way. That doesn't reflect our values, and this is not going to bring us what we need in terms of security, peace, and justice for our people, and certainly for both sides. But I do want to add something else. I think that one of the things that has been a consistent factor in the dispossession of Palestinians is connecting the Palestinian cause to whatever empire is vying for the region, whether it was the pan-Arab
Yes.
experiment in the past and currently the pan-Islamist project that is being pushed forward by the
Correct.
Islamic regime controlling Iran. And once Palestinians assert instead their local identity, their truly unique Palestinian Arab identity, I think there's so much potential for us to have a shared culture, a shared sense of history, a shared sense of what our politics can look like in cooperation here, because Palestinians on a local level are deeply connected to Jewish culture in so many different ways. And this is true for the Muslims and it's true for the Christians.
Yeah. So speaking of Christians, that's my next question. I want to start talking to you about Palestinian Christians or Israeli Christians because we don't really get to hear a lot from them, right? We get to hear people speaking for them, but they are, quite a small minority. You see all sorts of stuff online. Your people are like Candace Owens, right? People of her ilk are saying things like Christians in Israel are being kicked out of their homes and they're being spit on and things like that. I know that a lot of Palestinian Christians left under the Ottoman Empire because they didn't want to be the dhimmis. That's why places like Brazil and other areas in South America have like massive Palestinian Christian communities. Um, so I wanted to ask you, what is the general situation for Christians there? Are they caught between, how are they feeling? What is your sense in your discussions that you've had with them?
So first of all, just to reiterate, I'm not Christian. I'm Jewish, but I have had
Yeah.
the incredible privilege of speaking to many Christians, both Palestinian Christians as well as Israeli Arab Christians. And I think it's first of all, I think it's very disingenuous for people like Candace Owens to focus on the very painful and real events of Jewish extremists spitting on Christians or even physically attacking Christians. These things do happen. And it's important to call them out. I will continue to call them out and even confront those people that are engaged in it. And also recognizing that they're illegal under Israeli law. You cannot discriminate somebody on the basis of religion in the state of Israel. And I was very happy to see that even the prime minister, who I disagree with vehemently on a lot of things, if not most things, calling that out specifically, violence against Christians, as something that is incongruent with Israeli values and law. But at the same time, somebody like Candace Owens ignores the larger picture. And so let's zoom out a little bit and look at this larger picture. In 1900, Christians constituted about 25% of the Middle East.
Yeah.
Today, Christians are less than 5% of the region. Now, that didn't happen because of Jewish extremists spitting on Christians, as deplorable as that is. It happened because of a systematic abuse and oppression and discrimination of Christians in all of these different countries. What we're seeing right now in the Palestinian Authority is a perfect example of that. In 1980, Israeli-controlled Bethlehem, the place where Jesus was born, was about 80% Christian. Today, now that it's controlled by the Palestinian Authority, it's gone down to, some people say 13%, some people say less than 6%. How did that happen? Some Palestinian Christians will tell you that it's because of the occupation. Some other Palestinians will tell you, particularly those that have gotten refuge in the West, that it's actually because you would expect if that was the case, then you would see similar numbers of Muslims and Christians leaving. It's actually because there are still things like jizya, right? Mm-hmm. Extra tax put on dhimmi, on non-Muslims, being levied against Christians in places like Bethlehem. There was a woman who got refuge in, I think it was in Northern Europe. She talked about how while she was dealing with all the horrors the Palestinians were dealing with during the Second Intifada, with their clashes with the Israeli army, her uncle was also killed because he didn't pay jizya, in 2007. So this is still an ongoing reality, and it's something that needs to be recognized. Certainly, Christians are caught often in between, but let's be very clear, right? This is not a an even split in terms of like the trials and tribulations that Christians are facing, because Israel still is the only country in the Middle East in which the Christian population has grown.
Yeah. Now, when I walked through Old Jerusalem, there was, of course, the Christian Quarter, which is full of all of these Christian shops, and there's like also there's nowhere else in the Middle East are you going to see like these massive crosses with like Jesus and Mary and everything. Like that's even in Egypt, where we have like the largest population of Christians in the Middle East. You wouldn't see walking around in the markets like that's they still they even though they're not paying a jizya, they're very aware of their dhimmi status. They're very resentful, of course, because Egypt used to be a Christian country, and they have now they're just like a persecuted minority.
No, and in apropos Christians in Egypt, Copts. I actually ran into. I posted my interview with a Coptic Christian from Egypt who received refuge in Israel, and I just happened upon him in the street. I was speaking with my cousins, with my Arab cousins in Yaffo and Jaffa, and he was there, and he he was very open about everything he experienced, about his business being burned down by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and very happy about the freedoms that he was experiencing in Israel. And a lot of people, a lot of my Muslim followers, because I have a lot, and I engage most of the time, not in dialogue with Christians, most of the time I engage in dialogue with Muslims. Um, uh, and a lot of them were upset. They're like, "Oh, are you trying to say that this is all Muslims?" And this is absolutely not. But what we need for the betterment of the relations between the Islamic world and the Jewish world and the Christian world, we need to acknowledge these things, right? These are systemic injustices that are ongoing. And until you start to see us as true equals, as people that are
Mhm.
truly shareholders in the future of the Middle East, right, we're not going to be able to have peace and justice. Not for you and not for us.
That is the key right there. It's that superiority complex, unfortunately, that I was brought up in, and which is very common amongst Muslims, especially in the Arab world. That seeing each other as equal human beings, that's going to take some work. But what you're doing is really important, because we're so great at like pointing the finger at each other, but white people have white guilt, right? They do a lot of self-flagellation. They do a lot of looking at their history and like pointing at things that they did wrong and just like ignoring the parts that they did well. In the Arab world, we have the exact opposite problem, right? They like to even look at the most heinous things that they did and then find the good part about it or find the part to be proud of. And so there's not a lot of self-reflection. There is no self-reflection. And so when these stories come up, and I know this to be true for myself, when these stories come up, it's shocking because you've never heard it. All you've ever heard is how wonderful Arabs and Muslims are. We were told, and we are still told, that slaves under Arabs were happy, that they didn't want to be freed. We would get told stories of how Muhammad would like murder an entire tribe of Jews and then take the women as sex slaves. And then the women would fall in love with the Muslim soldiers. Like, these are the stories that we're told. Like, people name their children after these, Jewish princess or Jewish queen that was taken as a sex slave and had to survive, and they're like, no, 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 she fell in love. Like everything, they manipulate and pervert the stories, like I said, in such a way to always put themselves out on top. And so when you shine the light on the darkness and you say, look at what you're doing, like you're so good at discerning good from evil when you're pointing at Israel or when you're pointing at America, but like let's take a look at your own um, heritage and your own country and your own religion, and let's see the same thing there. Can you use the same discerning eye? It forces them to break out of that, that cognitive dissonance that they're living under. And so it is really helpful. And especially since they already trust you and they already like you and they're already listening to you. So when you show them these things, they know it's not coming from a place of, look what a fucker you are. It's coming from a place of like, pay attention. We all have this potential for evil within us, and, you know, make sure that you're not just looking outwards, but that you're looking inwards as well.
Yeah.
So that's really,
So
really
it's
important work.
absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. And part of what I do is when I speak to people, first of all, most Palestinians have traumatic experiences with Israelis, and so what I do is I first acknowledge that. I want them to tell me because I want to know because I don't know everything. I don't know everything they've experienced. I haven't experienced the world in the same way that they have. And then when I do that, then I start to speak to them also about my own story. And part of my story, setting aside things that I've experienced, is the story of my ancestors. I'm very open about the fact that my great grandfather, he was born basically as a second class citizen, and his sister, when he was sick and he was bedridden, they sent out his sister from the Jewish quarter to the Muslim quarter to retrieve water, and she was attacked and in a very violent, explicit way by an Arab policeman. And that was very common. Jewish women, they could do whatever they want with them. And there was going to be no justice in that case because there was almost never any justice for when Jews or Christians were violated in these ways. And my great grandfather was sick and tired. And so he actually got justice. He took it into his own hands. But and that was part of this movement of all of a sudden the Jews that were second class citizens that were dhimmi living in this society, when they stood up on their own feet because they saw all of a sudden now they had power. There was this movement called Zionism that said that you were actually agents in your own destinies, right? That's what inspired him to do it. But when I tell that story about the attack, about the assault, and say that was something that was actually really common, most of the time they acknowledge that it happened because they're not going to call me a liar to my face because they see that I'm trying to be genuine with them. But they will say, okay, that's just one case. And I'm like, it's not just one case. You really need to speak to us. It's one thing for you to say in a kind of tokenizing way, there were Palestinian Jews, or we have Samaritans in Nablus. Okay, great. Do you speak to them? Did you ask them what their ancestors or what they currently experience? Because if you do, you'll find out that it wasn't always peaches and cream. But it really does come down to exactly how you put it. We need to recognize that every one of us has the potential for evil. Every religion, every culture has its skeletons, has its darkness. And so we need to be able to be honest about that if we can create a new culture that gets rid of those things that are unnecessary, painful, discriminatory, so we can create new things together.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, before I open this up to the group, because there's people here that want to share their experiences with you or ask you questions, I just want to end our conversation, our one-on-one, on a positive note and say that there's lots of great things happening in the UAE, even Saudi Arabia, there's some positive changes happening. Morocco has always been pretty great, but it's nice to see that there are, pockets of light, pockets of hope in the Arab world for exactly what you're speaking about. So, the fact that Saudi Arabia is removing all of the anti-Semitic ahadith from their curriculum in school, the fact that, in Dubai, they had people singing the Israeli national anthem, there's things like that mean a lot because in the Arab world, it really does have to be top down. And that gives me hope. So I'm hoping that all of this hate and indoctrination that we're seeing in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan and in Gaza, etc., that can eventually these little pockets of light can get brighter and hopefully snuff out all that darkness.
I completely agree. And I think that people need to understand that cultures, religions aren't static. They're flexible, just like people are. They're dynamic unless we force them not to be, right? And what we're seeing right now is a painful, painful chapter, which has been written by men, mostly men, that have forced it to become static in the worst way possible. And so once we return back to that dynamism, to that ability to adapt and to create things in the way that human beings have always created things, with giving and taking, I think that we're going to find that there's going to be so much that we can create together. If Arabs and Jews, if Muslims, Christians, and Jews can come together in the Middle East to create some type of, pan-Semitic civilization, I think that that can be a revolutionary move for the whole planet, which is so divided by tribalism, hatred, intolerance.
Yeah, inshallah.
Inshallah.
All right, Becca, you're up.
So I wanted to ask about tokenization and how you avoid doing that in your work, because I'm finding anytime that I'm having a conversation, I'm in Canada on the West Coast, and it's been a weird shift because I'm from Ontario and rural Ontario, and where I grew up, it's controlled by the Hells Angels that are closely aligned with a bunch of neo-Nazi groups. So when I was younger, like I was 8 years old the first time I realized, like, oh, these people would kill me. And then I moved to BC, and it's much more liberal, or it was in a good sense, when I moved here. But it took me a while to realize that people who could recognize my last name as Jewish, it was because they were Jewish. And so it just sort of has put this position on me, though, where like, because like most of the time I'm just a white girl. But then in these conversations, I have to be the representative. And like, I am half Israeli, but that's not a way that I really identified prior to October 7th. And now I'm finding myself having to constantly be like, okay, well, what do you think about me? Because I'm half that. So how do you avoid doing that? Because it feels like I shouldn't have to be saying that to be able to have a conversation that is my line of thinking is people should probably be able to live without bombs coming down, or the idea that a bomb could come down at any time. That's the basic of my philosophy towards this issue. So yeah, how do you avoid that?
So a short version of how I got involved in this in the first place. I found that, the unique experience of my family, where we had all these different elements of, Jewish, American, Israeli, Middle Eastern, Caribbean. I learned very quickly that most people weren't familiar with that combination of things. And so I found myself being put in a position constantly where I was a spokesperson for Jews, whether it was Jews in general, whether it was Israeli Jews, Middle Eastern Jews, Caribbean Jews, Jews of color, period. And in the beginning, it was very frustrating, like I think it is for most people. Over time, I learned to really embrace it because unfortunately, the reality is that tribalism, this type of identity politics, is so deeply embedded in human culture. And there are moments in history where we kind of like take a break from it and we kind of embrace lofty ideals, and that becomes the center of what organizes us. But very quickly, when things get tough, we revert back to that thing which is so deeply ingrained in our essence and our being. And we're in one of those moments right now. And so I think that, my advice to you is that even if you see yourself and perceive yourself in different ways, unfortunately, bigots, racists, anti-Semites will remind you how they see you and who you are. And so my advice to you is just embrace that identity, embrace the fullness of your complex intersectional identity, and use that in order to lead the direction, a place that you want, right? Because I always tell people, whether it's a conversation about racism, colorism, or it's a conversation about anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment, we need to, at the end of the day, acknowledge the importance of these identities, and how it's guided history and how it's guiding current events, but with the goal of rising above it, of rising above that into an identity which is rooted in consciousness, not these kind of more superficial things.
So what I find challenging here, though, is that like me identifying as all the things that I see beautiful and diverse about my connection to Judaism, it doesn't fit the popular narrative. And so I find that even though, like you're saying, like these aspects of our personality should, I don't like the word qualify us to be a voice on, but it should be able to lend more nuance to it than it does. And I'm just wondering if, like, when you've been having conversations, if you have experienced that sort of like you're not in the right box that the progressive left is made as your identity. How do you get around that? Because yeah, a lot of people just they twist what I'm saying to make it so that it seems like I'm a bad Jew or whatever they want to
So
imply.
I'll tell you how I do it, right? So first of all, I almost never fit into anyone's boxes because I exist in too many boxes. So there's not a box that's made just for me. To the extent that people want to push me in a box, I'll use that to my advantage sometimes. If somebody, like for example, a lot of people in the anti-Zionist camp or an anti-Israel camp, the anti-Jewish camp, will like to kind of tokenize Palestinian Jews. They always say, "Oh, there was Palestinian Jews. We had peace before the state of Israel. Palestinian Jews were getting along just fine." And so some people could respond to that by being like, no such thing as Palestinian Jews ever. We were Jews that were colonized by this concept of Palestine. And my approach is the opposite of that. I say, no, okay, you talking about Palestinian Jews? That's my ancestors, right? That's my family. And this was our experience, right? And so, they can, at the end of the day, they can dismiss whatever I say if they want, but at their own peril, because somebody else is going to be listening. Oh, they've been talking about Palestinian Jews this whole time. Here's one just started talking right now. And they just dismissed what he said completely. That type of hypocrisy will be apparent to those who are willing to see it.
Okay. Thank you.
Nice. Good strategy.
Yeah.
All right. Tochi, you're next.
Hey, what's up, Yasmine Yirmiyahu? I hope I'm saying that right.
Perfect.
Yes. So I just want to make a comment. I'm gonna push back just a little bit. I mean, I respect your position, and obviously you've been in the region. I grew up in the Middle East, but I've never actually myself been to the regions of Palestine or Israel. My family has, but the point is, you're someone that's certainly more, I think, knowledgeable than I am. But I would say my issue is I'm very sort of tired of hearing sort of this both sides thing, or like, and I think that Israelis, look, I think Jewish people in general, they, what is it, Tukulum or something, have a certain, like, motivation to do good. So they always sort of want to self-analyze, which is absolutely great. And I think it's a wonderful thing. But my issue with doing that when it comes to this particular conflict is that, let's be honest, like Muslim extremism is everywhere. It's not just, and I think sometimes when we talk about making it a both sides thing, it almost localizes the issue as though it's just a Palestinian, quote unquote, versus a Jewish or Israeli thing, when in fact Muslim extremism is literally everywhere. As a Nigerian, we deal with Boko Haram. Just the other day, there was an attack, there was ISIS attack that was foiled in Toronto, where I'm at, right? I mean, we literally see this stuff everywhere. So clearly there's an issue with the ideology and the behavior. We look at
and
various
Nigerian
parts of
Christians
Africa.
as well.
Absolutely. I mean, Somalia, just Al-Shabaab, and I have
Yep.
Somalian friends, and like we've seen Arab Muslim extremism everywhere. So I think this idea that somehow it's just ludicrous to me, because it's like it's a pattern of behavior that's been going on for frankly too long, if you ask me. So I would hope that when you're having your conversations, and I do like that you're willing to, of course, meet with quote unquote the other side, and I think that's a very admirable thing. But I do wonder, is there at any level, are some of these people even aware of the larger picture? Because it's a pattern of behavior that's literally worldwide. It's not just in the areas of Palestine. If it were just in the areas of Palestine, I probably maybe would not almost have no opinion on it. But the fact of the matter is that when Hamas is killing black folk on October 7th that are probably not Jewish at all, it makes me wonder, like, what's going on here? And I lived in the Middle East, and I was, I went to high school out there. It was quite racist. So I've seen this kind of behavior up front, I would say. Anyway, that was just my comment to you, brother. But I love what you're doing, man, and I love your channel.
I appreciate that a lot. And I resonate with the vast majority of things you said. And this is something that, a part of an ongoing dialectic I have with people that live in regions that are engaged with in conflict with various Islamist actors, including a lot of my Igbo brothers and sisters that live in Nigeria and are dealing with violence from Fulani herdsmen and different groups
I'm
that are
Igbo, dude.
associated with.
I know this
Okay,
whole story. Yeah, so
there you
and
go.
again,
So
I
I
don't
don't I
fear
don't need to
Jewish
break it down.
people. I've never in my life feared a Jewish terrorist, but like there's literally tons of these Muslim extremists out here. So clearly there's an imbalance. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. But thank you.
So let me clarify a point, and that's that when I talk about the both sides kind of thing, it's on the local level, and you'll notice that when I speak to people across the spectrum, and it's not like I speak out extremists of either type, it happens organically. And you'll notice that there's a lot more people engaged in this type of eliminationist rhetoric on the Palestinian side as a result of the dominance of extremist Islamist ideology in that society. At the same time, I think it's important to understand that when I'm dealing with a Palestinian, I'm not just speaking to somebody who's a representative of the Islamic regime in Iran or a representative of this ideology. I'm also speaking to somebody that is quite literally like my family member, my neighbor. And so I understand and I recognize when we talk about the broad scope of the history of the conflict, how these pan-Arabist and then pan-Islamist entities hijacked in a way the desire for Palestinian Arabs to have good, meaningful, dignified lives in this land. But at the same time, keeping in mind that I don't blame the Palestinian peasant that was alive, the felah that was living in the land during that time period, right? And so it's with those people that I want to build a future with, right? Somebody who wants to, no matter what, destroy all of the states in the Middle East to resurrect a, Islamist caliphate, right? That person is not, in this both sides scenario. That person is an enemy to anybody that wants freedom, justice, and equality on this planet. At the same time, I recognize that many Palestinians, they were indoctrinated into that. And so even at the same time as they have these ideas, because of this indoctrination, they also have memories of, good relationships that they had with Jews, many of them tell me about a Jewish wet nurse they had, or a Jewish or the Jewish mohel, somebody who circumcised the Muslim boys, right? These are also part of the stories they had, as well as this kind of story about Canaanite or Jewish roots that they have as well, and some customs that they kept that connect them to Jewish and Canaanite culture. And so my hope is that we can, in recognizing the geopolitical context of two empires basically clashing, that we can also use that as an opportunity to assert our local identities and create that type of local peace that we need.
Wonderful. And if I could just interject here too, what you're saying is absolutely true. So Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic regime of Iran, Houthis, etc., those are enemies of humanity, and they are enemies of the Palestinian people too. And people have started to see that now when Hamas is like full throttle talking about, oh, no, all these tunnels that we built are not to protect the Palestinian people, they're to protect us, Hamas. They even know, they see themselves as a separate entity. They're like, the Palestinian people are not our business. They're the UN's problem. They can keep them safe. It's not up to us, right? And we see how they take the food and the aid that is being sent to these Palestinian people, and they take it and they sell it back to them, right? Like we see how they treat the Palestinians. And so they are not, as some people like to believe, the freedom fighters or the revolutionaries or the people that are there to support, the Palestinian conflict or the Gazan people or whatever. No, absolutely not. They are terrorists there to support their delusion of a caliphate, which isn't just the Middle East, it's global, right? Like, let's not forget, we see this kind of stuff happening all over Europe. Everybody's forgotten 9/11 now somehow, but in America as well. Like this is a global issue. And Israel is just proximity right now, is all it is, right? Proximity, and also the fact that they have so much support globally. That's also giving oxygen. It's giving them fuel, right? But Israel is just simply the first step, right? They're not done there. They want to get rid of Christians. They want to get rid of Hindus. They want to get rid of everybody who isn't an Islamist like them, even other Muslims. You can be a gay Muslim. You could be a, Ismaili. You could be Ahmadi. All of you are getting killed, right? Any woman that doesn't want to wear hijab, they don't care. It doesn't matter. We saw them on October 7th. They killed all sorts of Arabs. There was all sorts of Arab Bedouin women in hijab, and they killed them too. They don't care. If you're not with them in their ideology, they want you dead. So it is really important what you've said there. I know it's a distinction that is really difficult for people to make these days because they see the videos of how a bunch of just monsters, animalistic, disgusting, filth, just the most heinous examples of humanity were chasing after the truck with Shani Luke, right? They saw things like that. That's hard for any person to see, right? But as an Israeli to see that, right? So it is really hard for people now to make that distinction between Gazan people and Hamas. And it is especially difficult to make that distinction because a lot of those Gazan people are indoctrinated with hate, you know? And so, but there's a big difference because they are like, a lot of times they're just like, Masakin, you know what I mean? They're uneducated, they don't have power, and it's like this is the Kool-Aid that they have been given, and this is the Kool-Aid that they've drank. But there is hope. They can come out of it, you know? But if you are part of one of these many, 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 as you were saying, Tochi, all across the planet, all of these different Islamist organizations or all of these jihadi groups, right? Then then I agree with you. That's just somebody who is an enemy of humanity, and that's a very clear us versus them issue at that point.
Yeah. And I want to add something brief to that, and that's that, we don't see most of the time how much these regimes employ violence on a daily basis in order to maintain the control that they have.
Yes.
We're all incredibly inspired at the movement in Iran to free their country from the Islamic Republic. That is not something that we can take for granted. It is incredible that they were able to do that. And likewise, there are Palestinians from the beginning that were engaged in that type of resistance to this all or nothing rhetoric. Haj Amin Hosseini and his gang, in order to hijack the Palestinian Arab narrative to one which was wedded to pan-Arabism and to pan-Islamism, was built on the assassination of moderate voices in Palestinian Arab society that at that early point were talking about compromise with the Jewish community. But they were destroyed. And so I understand why so many Jews, like myself, are traumatized from these events, and we have every right to be. But I think in order for us to be truthful about the situation, while we have to do what we need to do in order to defend ourselves and to survive in this region, just like everybody should have the right to, we also need to understand that as a part of that is developing and cultivating these relationships with the people that will be the backbone of a resistance movement to this imperial project.
Yes, well said. Ozzy, you're up.
All right, thank you both so much for doing this. It's been so educational and inspiring. And my question for you, Yirmiyahu, is in terms of the new consciousness and the new identity that you spoke about in this region, what can people who live here do? People who perhaps speak English in this region, or supporters around the world who want to see peace in this region. Are there any particular next steps that you see as being meaningful in working toward building this new culture?
It's an excellent question. I can't emphasize enough how important language is. It's one thing to be able to understand somebody in a secondary language, right? And there was the famous quote by Nelson Mandela, right? That if you speak to someone in their second language, you speak to their mind. But if you speak to them in their mother tongue, you speak to their heart. I've seen this play out in so many different contexts, in so many different places. And it's especially true here. And so I really think that anybody who it cares about this, that lives in the region, and they don't speak Arabic, they need to speak Arabic. If they don't speak Hebrew, they should learn Hebrew. And in creating these bridges, and Persian and all the other different languages, if we really want to create these cultural bridges, which will create new opportunities, both cultural, religious, political, I think the language is something that is so essential. But beyond that, right, I think that there is just this cultural acquaintance that we need. There's so many people that live in this land, in Israel, Palestine, that even though we're like neighbors, like, all of us live next to, if you're Jewish, you live close to an Arab village, even if you're not aware of it. And everybody who lives in Arab villages lives next to a Jewish village, even if they're not aware of it, right? Yet there's not a lot of cultural crossing happening. There's not a lot of, I'm going to come over to your house and meet your family, and you're going to come over to my house to meet my family. We need to do that, right? It's like, it's important work because it doesn't just give us relationships that we're going to need when times get tough. It also gives us a sense of familiarity that allows our imagination to think of new possibilities.
You know, it's interesting because I hear everything you're saying, and I hear what you're saying about Arabic. I'm wondering how high on the priority list it is for people who live here to learn Arabic fluently. And if you have any good recommendations for Arabic teachers while I'm asking. And, you know, the other piece is like Yasmin, over the course of this conversation, said, like, we're bleeding, you know, and I feel, unfortunately, fear when I go out of my home and I see the workers from Palestinian villages in my neighborhood. Like, you know, I'm walking with my son tonight to the candy store, and these guys are speaking Arabic on motorcycles, and something's exploding on their motorcycle. I'm like, let's run, you know, like it's not, and they were fixing their motorcycle. And, you know, it's just really hard for me to want to reach out a hand to people I don't know when I do know what they've learned about me. And I don't hate them. I hate the system that's indoctrinated them. And so it's a tough place to be in when you know you're here and you've many Israelis, including myself, like we've started to learn about the systems and we're understanding how these things came into play. But to open our homes is like, that's, you know, and I'm happy to have, you know, Arab friends and Muslim friends, you know, I'm open to all of that, but it's a stretch, you know, to invite certain people into your home. It's scary, in all honesty.
You know, like we say, shwaya shwaya, slowly, slowly, right? You don't have to like just open your heart like, hey, put on, you know, on Facebook or Twitter, you know, open house, come on, come all. But it starts with a friendship, or it starts with a conversation, right? And in the context of Israeli Jews, far too few Israeli Jews have Arab Israeli friends and colleagues, right? And so I think that that's
Right.
probably a key starting point. We need to get involved with the communities that are closer to us to feel more like home. And so getting to know that was a big part of my life too, right? I had very close relationships with Palestinians abroad, but when I came to when I returned to the land, the first relationships I developed with Arabs before they were Palestinian, they were Israeli. You know, I taught English at a Arab high school in Jaffa, and I developed close relationships with the students there. There were 11th graders and 12th graders, and then I developed incredible relationships with the Druze community, right? That in Arabic totally identifies as Arab, right? With the Bedouin community, and all these communities were affected by Hamas terrorism, and not just by Hamas terrorism, they're also affected by Islamist extremist violence in their own societies, right? There's struggles that are happening internally too, and so as you get that familiarity, you develop those friendships, then that kind of the fear goes down a bit, because then you know what they're saying, you know what's happening. Even if you don't understand the words, you get the body language, right? You get the idioms, and so when that happens, then all of a sudden the Palestinians look a lot less scary, because you'll notice one of the first things you realize when you get to know Israeli Arab culture and identity is it's connected like this. It's connected at the hip to Palestinian culture and identity, because they emerged out of the same population, out of the same community. And so we have to keep our guards up, right? We don't live in Switzerland, and we should never forget that, because ethnic minorities in the Middle East, in a Middle East ruled by empires and imperialistic fantasies, when they forget what kind of region we live in, it doesn't end well for us. And this is, unfortunately, we're speaking right now. We're around the 10th anniversary of the Yazidi genocide, in which thousands of Yazidis, and particularly the enslavement of their women, happened at the hands of ISIS, right? And so we can't forget that this is a region in which, if we don't have our guards up and we're not strong about our identity and who we are, and why we're here, we could very easily become the next victims of that. And so what I'm proposing is that we have these conversations, we build these relationships, but from a place of pride, from a place of strength, and respect, because that's how peace is made in the Middle East.
So relationships, you would say, is the piece.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I want to add too, Ozzy, that when I was in Israel, the Arab Israelis were more nationalistic than any other Israelis that I met, because it's kind of like Iraqi Americans, you know, they are the most nationalistic Americans, the ones that, you know, came recently, not the ones that have been here for generations, because they know what they survived, right? They're grateful and they know what the other option was. So I was really shocked. I wasn't expecting it to find that Israeli Arabs, like I could have more of like a nuanced conversation about the current government and stuff like that with other Israelis, but Israeli Arabs were just like, we are so lucky to be here. We are so grateful to have our human rights. Like no other Arabs get to live the way we live. Like the women, my God, the women are so grateful for the freedoms that they have. So Yirmiyahu, like your suggestion for her to, meet up with Israeli Arabs, I think that's a really fantastic suggestion. And just like they're so closely intertwined with the Palestinian culture, they're very, very closely intertwined with the Israeli culture as well. And they feel like they're Israelis first and foremost. And I'm talking about even like Bedouin Arabs, right? Like they are Israelis first and foremost. And you will see that connection, right? And they speak Hebrew too, and they may not speak English. I don't know if you speak Hebrew or not, but hopefully there won't be too much of a language barrier.
I just want to share like a quick anecdote. When the war started, I spoke to a neighbor who is in the education department, and she was mentioning that in a lot of Arab Israeli high schools, people would come in support of Gazans, like in kafiyas, and actually like siding with Gaza in this, Gaza, really Hamas in this war. And so I think for me, that's where it gets very muddled. I have great relationships with, my Arab Israeli neighbors, the people who work around here. And I'm not like by any means walking around cowering when I hear Arabic, but there is an issue at play, especially when we're talking about intermingling with people who've gone through the education system that is indoctrination to hate us. So it's, in my mind, it's very nuanced, but I do appreciate what you're saying about the relationships.
No, and I think
Yeah,
it's
and if I
important
could
to acknowledge that. Sorry, go ahead, Nathan.
I was going to criticize your country, to be honest, because I really don't think that having separate schools like that is helpful at all. Like, I understand we're doing sort of what we do here in the left wing America with the idea of like, we want you to have like your cultural identity and we want to make sure you have your own school so you can feel comfortable together, blah, blah, blah. No, not helpful. Not helpful. You're creating ghettos. And exactly what you were talking about. There's not that opportunity for people to grow up together and to get to know each other. The most open-minded people that I know are Arabs that went to Jewish schools or vice versa, right? But as long as people are in their silos, it doesn't matter if you're like next door neighbors. If you're not interacting together, and then you're always going to see each other as another.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. I think the biggest issue that we could solve quickly, a lot of different problems would be merging the education system in Israel. All these different separate things. It's not good for the various Jewish communities that have different educational systems. It's not good for Jews and Arabs in the country. And I think it's important to acknowledge that notwithstanding the educational system, there's a lot of diversity and complexity within the Arab Israeli population, including those that identify as Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. And I saw that firsthand when I was teaching at a school in Yaffa. I saw that they had Palestinian flags in the school, and they learned a Palestinian version of the history of Israel Palestine. And at the same time, they're also very, very happy and appreciative of the democratic freedoms and the ability for particularly the girls to go out and dress however they wanted to. And also an idea like we would never give up our Israeli citizenship. And that's pretty widespread. At the same time, a very deep sense of identification and empathy with the Palestinian cause, with Palestinian suffering in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and Gaza. And I think that's a positive thing. I think we need to look at that not as a potential fifth column, like some people do in Israeli society, but rather as an opportunity for us to really use those relationships in, I don't know if maybe use isn't the right term, but really, implement those relationships in creating the type of conversation that we need between our societies, because we're not going anywhere. This land is going to continue to be occupied is not the right term either, inhabited by Israelis and Palestinians, by Jews and Arabs. And we need to turn that into a strength as opposed to this debilitating conflict that it's become.
Okay, Sarah with an H, you're next.
Thank you. And thank you, Yasmine, for always bringing on great guests and being, anyways, you're both amazing. So I'm going to ask about life in the diaspora. I feel like I always ask this question when Yasmine has guests, like whenever I get to ask a question, it's about Ashkenazis in the diaspora. I think in the climate that we're living, there's like a racial social currency going on. And it right now feels like before, like white people are at the bottom, mosques were at the bottom. Now Ashkenazis are, it feels like we have no authority to like talk about even being Jewish. Like the Chazar theory, I think is like so widespread. Like people don't even know what it is, but they don't believe that we're real Jews. They don't believe that we have an authority to speak on being Jewish or Israel. I mean, I think at least the space that I'm in, which might be a little more like left than others, and it feels like we're always being like distorted and twisted, and like we have to like constantly be working with this. And I know that I have been falling for it because like since a few years I've been with my partner's Mizrahi, and my eyes are like completely open about like just so much bullshit, and also so much of the way Ashkenazis talk over Mizrahi suffering and things that have happened throughout history. So I want to ask you about like, I don't know if it's like communication tools or just like moving through this space where like Ashkenazi, we know we're real Jews, and like we, but we are constantly being made to like feel guilty or feel sorry because like Israel is like white and Palestine is brown, according to things going on right now. So do you have ideas of how to move through this, about dialogue? I mean, I was mentioning, like, I think Standing Together is like one of the most popular dialogue groups, but it also feels like a dialogue group that like is only about holding Israel accountable for like everything. So the diaspora is such a weird place too, because like, I mean, it feels like Arab and Palestinian diasporas are also quite radical and are mixing with like lefty radical. So like, I just want to ask you about moving through, I know I'm talking in circles a little bit, but like moving through this climate as an Ashkenazi person, like taking a stand, but like, you know, trying to be fair, but also taking a stand with the identity that we hold.
I think it's a very important question, and I think that a lot of people are wrestling with that right now because it's this version of anti-Semitism is being iterated as a uprising against white supremacy, and Ashkenazi Jews are becoming like the conduits of white supremacy, and therefore the ultimate representation of this evil that needs to be defeated. And I think that first of all, it's important for us to understand that, and by us I mean the Jewish community, that the experience of Jews on the European continent from even before the Spanish Inquisition, but especially from the Spanish Inquisition onwards, was one of a Orientalism, a hate for the Oriental, quote unquote, other, the Semitic other, being the Jew. And that form of racism was most of the time and most violently expressed towards Ashkenazi Jews. And so that is what developed into the Jewish question of Europe. And in many ways, it became the prototype for how Western society would deal with racism in general. And as all of these progressive left intellectuals will rightly point out, right, they didn't deal with that question right. They didn't give it the right answer. It wasn't an answer which was full of tolerance on the European continent. And so Ashkenazi Jews, as these Middle Easterners in diaspora, bore the brunt of that. Now, at the same time, one of the main tools that Ashkenazi Jews employ in order to protect themselves from that racial hatred was through attempting to assimilate into Europeanness, into whiteness. And so a lot of Jews have to deal with that history. They have to deal with that legacy of their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, trying to diminish the aspects of their identity which connect them to the Middle East, the aspects of their culture which connect them to the Middle East, and have a reckoning with that and assert themselves proudly as who they are in their full sense, right? Because Ashkenazi Jewish culture, it is this fusion of European and Middle Eastern culture, of the Levant, of a culture that was uniquely developed in this land of Israel. And that in this process of enslavement and dispossession and displacement to Europe created this unique identity, which we know as Ashkenazi Jewish identity and culture. And so I think what Ashkenazi Jews need to do is proudly assert that right now, because that is an authentic representation of Ashkenazi Jewish identity. And it completely positions them not as the agents of white supremacy, but some of the first, if not the first, victims of white supremacy. And so if there needs to be some type of justice in that fight against white supremacy, I think that not including Ashkenazi Jews in that equation can't be described as anything but anti-Semitic.
Thank you. And can you speak to building solidarity where possible in the diaspora, if it's possible, like how to even find people? Feels like there's a lot of extremism in North America, and like, yeah, and go ahead.
So two things. I would say, number one, don't give up space. There's a lot of actions that we're seeing take place right now, trying to remove Jews from certain spaces. And so I think that as much as I know it's uncomfortable, we have to stand our ground. We cannot be ethnically cleansed from various intellectual, cultural, educational spaces because our identity is being attacked by them. We need to figure out ways to stand together with the Jews that are also in this place, because they're always going to be finding some Jews that are inhabiting space for most of the time. And the other thing I would say is that there are so many Jews that have these intersectional identities, right? I'm one of them, right? And so there's so many Jews that would be described by certain spaces as Jews of color, Black Jews, brown Jews, Latino Jews, LGBTQ plus Jews. These Jews are in those spaces too. And it's much more difficult for the anti-Semites in far left spaces to marginalize them. And so I think that as long as we're working together, we're on the same page, I think we should be able to, leverage our relationships to fight for our rightful place in these places.
I agree with you that there needs to be more internal dialogue and support of non-Ashkenazis. I actually meant building solidarity with I guess I'm like thinking like Palestinian diaspora basically, but I don't know how realistic it is. It's sometimes, or even just Middle Eastern diasporas. It's very easy with like Iranian people a lot. I think there's like a lot of natural spaces to both be against the Islamic regime, but I mean like more generally, sometimes it's hard to find because we want to like build bridges everywhere, but it's hard to find, I think, the people with whom to build.
You're here,
bridges.
Sarah. You're here.
Here, I know, but like, yeah,
this is what we're doing. These are these grassroots.
No, I know.
What the work that Yirmiyahu is doing. There's what is it called? The third narrative, I think, is, and then that is it called? Unboxed? What is it that you host, Yirmiyahu?
Unpacked.
Yeah. So I guess places like that, is that what you're referring to, Sarah?
Yes. It just feels like there's not a lot of people, basically. The people here count a lot, and I mean, like, have done a great deal for like my mental survival. I think even being here, I mean, like, yeah, it's just hard to find in many spaces that I guess I thought I would find it. I was in social work school, didn't find it at all. I'm not going to go to my graduation because I'm like scared of those people. Like, it's really like, these people you want to build bridges, but there's like a lot of rejection, basically. So that's what I'm saying. How do you find people? Is it possible?
Well, first, I want to say a few things. Number one, I just want you to know that I get a lot of messages, and every day I get tens, if not hundreds, of messages from Palestinians that live here and live in the region, supporting the work, wanting to build more, continue the conversations, build more bridges. But in addition, it's not rare for me to receive messages from Palestinians in the diaspora as well. it's less rare, and it's because there's a much more, I would say, toxic environment of erasure in these diaspora circles. And just like I think perhaps, some Palestinians would be more surprised that in diaspora Jewish communities, it's maybe more common to hear people say Palestinians don't exist or something like that. I think it's just because like extremist voices rise to the top when you have no interaction with the other side, right? And it's a lot easier when you're abroad to have zero interaction with the other side and then create this kind of demonic image of the other. And certainly that's the way that a lot of these Palestinian diaspora communities have come to imagine Israelis. But there are people that are reaching out, and there are opportunities. And it really also does depend on what's going on in the region. There were periods before the war where I had a lot more relationships with Palestinians in diaspora. Right now, it's a little bit less, right? Because these poisonous environments of hate are spreading, and they're a lot more intense in the diaspora than they are here, I would say, in many ways. So I think it's also just about waiting a little bit, but there are opportunities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I let you speak, Elishiva, I just want to read this message here because it's really beautiful. This was written by Adar. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Adar says, ever since I've started learning Arabic, I'm an Israeli Jew, I found a tremendous amount of beautiful people that believe in the two-state solution and peace for both nations between the river and the sea. So that's nice to hear. Elishiva.
Actually, this changes the original question I was going to ask. You had mentioned the third narrative, and I said no. But I asked Yirmiyahu, are there other organizations that you know of that do, I guess, a more like, I guess it's the same question as Sarah, like a community outreach? Obviously, I don't support the third narrative because it's one narrative. But this kind of dialogue we have, like we're doing right now, and then somebody, I don't remember who had asked previously, about like, is it helpful to learn Arabic? Which, yes, I think it's very helpful. You realize there's a lot of people that are afraid to like speak, but they're not afraid to speak to us, and that's really what we need more than anything. And we can amplify their voices, but they're afraid to speak out in their own community, and that's understandable. But yeah, what are other groups or organizations or even influencers that you know of that we can support and keep those dialogues going?
Other than yourself.
Right.
Yeah, so other than following that Semite and looking at the educational content that we create at the Unpacked YouTube channel and socials, a shameless plug right there. I think that there are definitely some other voices that are engaged in the space in a very productive manner in the way that you described. From my understanding, the third narrative is doing good work. I'm not familiar with anything, I don't know, not kosher there. I think that just as, Israelis or Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, however they want to identify, they have the right to have their own narrative just like anybody else. And if they want to call it the third narrative, I think that's fine. As long as they're not saying that they have a monopoly on the narrative, which I don't think they are. But aside from them, I think that, there's, organizations like I don't know if you would call it an organization. There's the Dugri Project, which is working on bringing Israeli Jews and Arabs together in terms of like really going through that narrative work. There's also the Home, which engages in a lot of like dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians before the war. Now they're not doing it as much, but hopefully they will be doing it after the war as well. There's also the Roots organization, Shorashim, Judur, and they're engaged in a lot of that type of dialogue narrative work in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. I'm sure there are others, but those are just the ones that come to mind right away. And I think that what brings them all together is this desire to create spaces for dialogue and for conversation, for honest conversation.
Another question: what is an organization that you recommend giving tzedakah to right now?
Oh, what a good A good call. That's a great one.
Free
Hmm.
hearts, free minds.
Free hearts, free
Yeah.
minds. I share your content. Like right now, a big thing is obviously the war. We still have soldiers that need vests and helmets, night vision goggles, and things like that. And I think that's another thing is a lot of people don't realize how people came together overnight. October 7th, people paid for their flights to go into duty and go into Gaza. So we have organizations of things like that. We have there's a Chesed fund, which I like a lot. There's we have funds for our wounded soldiers. Also love those. There's a lot, but I like to whenever I can.
So I'll plug one for you. So it's really amazing that everybody's rallied around and helping many of the first responders. But in addition to that, a lot of people don't think about the agriculturalists, right? The people that are really the backbone of our nutritional needs. And Israel has had a serious crisis in terms of keeping its agriculturists, its farmers on their feet. And I've actually gotten to the point where they've had to, during a time of war, bring in fruits and veg from Turkey, which, as we just saw, I think it was last week, was threatening with invading the country. So how absurd it is that we were becoming agriculturally reliant on Turkey during that time period. Erdogan with his, Muslim Brotherhood, Islamist regime and fantasy of rebuilding the Ottoman Empire. So Save a Farm is an organization that's involved in helping support the farmers and making sure that they're able to survive this very challenging time.
Got it. That's great. So, Sarah.
Hi, Yasmin. Hi, Yirmiyahu. Thank you for doing this. This has been amazingly educational, and I've been sitting here having goosebumps because you are an amazing speaker. You talk about all these little details, and as a nerd, to me, it's like fresh air. I'm having so much fun. I don't want this to finish at all. So also, thank you for mentioning the Iranian people. I'm from Iran. So every time Yasmin says something about Iran, I feel like I'm seen, I'm validated, I exist, I'm real, because we get erased very easily. We don't fit in any narratives. We are not Arabs. So we constantly are told that we are not Muslims. We are Shia. When I say we, as ex-Muslims, we don't fit the narrative of the brown, poor people who need saving. So there are so many different ways that I get erased on a daily basis. And every time a guest on Yasmin's podcast talks about Iranian, I feel like I'm going to cry. So thank you so much for doing that. You've been talking about conversation. I have a comment about that, and then I have a question for you. Toshi mentioned this very brilliantly. Thank you so much, Toshi. To me, I don't understand how you can have a conversation with a people who is hell-bent on killing you. As a rebellious woman, as an ex-Muslim, I get murdered if I set foot anywhere in the Middle East. So I do not know how you would, that patience that you have. It's amazing. I understand it. I think we put too much on the Israelis and the Jewish people when we talk about peace at a time where there are hostages, more than 300 days. We need to acknowledge that. And you did already, and I don't know if you want to talk about this again, but I don't understand how we can have peace unless Islam comes to the 21st century, where the majority of them do not want to do that. Talking about this conversation is not realistic. We get here, we talk about it, it's really therapeutic and helpful, and I feel like this is fresh air for me. But in real world, when you go out, they want to murder you, and that's just as real. My question, however, for you is, do you get pushback from the Western audience that you have? Because there was yesterday, we had this video from Toronto, this woman in fishnets and keffiyeh and a mask, and I'm sitting there thinking, what is happening here? You are cosplaying my oppression in the uniform of my oppressors, and you want me to stand behind you and chant for you. And he's recording the police in Toronto. I'm like, do I take the fishnet or do I take the keffiyeh? And when we talk about them, they have this white savior complex that you cannot reach them. There's no way. So the problem for me is not just the Muslims and Islamists, because for me, they're both the same. It's also the Westerners who erase us completely from the conversation and I've had this conversation with Yasmine a lot, it's frustrating. We are real. We are still trying. To me, it should be completely gone. Yasmine still hopes that we can bring Islam to the 21st century. We have differences. We talk about it a lot. What is your experience like? Do they do the same thing to you? How do you reach out to these people? Because to me, it's just a lost cause. And of course, I would like to have a conversation with them as well.
You raised a lot of really incredible points. I'm going to try and touch on all of them. The first is that I want to make it very clear that my emphasis is on dialogue with the people that are directly involved in the conflict, whether it's like, directly involved in the sense of living in this land and being a part of one of these groups that are, that are physically in conflict, or, broadly speaking, like the Lebanese people that are being, are dealing with Hezbollah's occupation of southern Lebanon, or the Iranian people that are being occupied by the Islamic Republic, the Sudanese people that are dealing with something similar in different ways. That's my focus. In terms of like our supporters or our fans abroad, that's very secondary to me. And so, there are times in which I've been able to engage in conversations with people that espouse that type of, strange, obsessive cosplaying. And I've actually been able to have success in those conversations because I've basically destroyed all of their stereotypical, preconceptions about the conflict by just introducing myself. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, I need to reassess what I'm doing here. Am I on the right side? Sometimes, or most of the times, it doesn't work, and that doesn't bother me because that's not my main goal. What I would like to do is help create some type of ripple effect change from the core. And then I think from there, at some point it'll get to them, or those people will go on to move on to a different conflict that they can, feel good about. And I now want to relate to what you said about, talking about peace, truth, reconciliation, justice in a time of war. I'm feeling the pain just like other Israelis. Obviously, there are people that are feeling a lot more than me right now, but I lost people that were near and dear to me on October 7th. And, every Israeli will tell you, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, that even if they didn't lose somebody personally, like I did, they were separated by 1 degree, 2 degrees at the most. Such a small place. I'm directly involved. I'm directly affected by everything that happens here. And so I have no illusions about the enemy that we're contending with. And what they would like to do to me and my family and my loved ones, regardless of their ethnicity and their religion. On October 8th, I also, in addition to making sure that, seeing who was hurt, who was killed, and who was safe, my Palestinian friends that live under a Palestinian Authority regime were reaching out to me and seeing if I was okay. So the reality is very complex, and my activism is very much inspired by the people that, in light or despite all of the intense hatred and the violence, were able to create revolutionary changes. Right? Nelson Mandela was being faced by a violent, hateful, bloody opposition from those that wanted to continue to, to prop up apartheid. And obviously, I'm not drawing any parallels between apartheid South Africa and Israel. Martin Luther King, likewise, they were literally getting beaten. They were facing horrible violence, but yet they were able to affect this change. Right? When the founders of modern Zionism were going around and saying, "Hey, the Europeans are never going to accept us. The Iraqi regime is never going to accept us. The Ethiopian government is never going to accept us as equals. It's time for us to return home." There were so many people that were so blindly responsive to that, with hate and with violence. Yet they were able to act and to create the groundwork, to lay the groundwork for a new future. And so that's what inspires me. And so I think it's important for us to have these type of, therapeutic but hopeful conversations, because even if now is not the time for actually realizing that change, there will be a time when it will be possible. And the groundwork that we lay right now is what's going to facilitate it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. Thank you. And thank you, Yasmine.
Okay, thank you so much for spending so much of your time with us and answering these questions for us and giving us so much to think about, teaching us so much about the history of Jewish people and Arab people and Caribbean people, and really giving us so much insight and so many things to think about. I just want to give you the last word if you want to share with us where people can find you, whether it's That Semite or whether you're hosting Unpacked, or there are some people here that still have questions for you. So if you're willing to share any kind of email address or anything, let me know and I can forward on the questions to you. Some final words, some parting words for us, some words of advice, or whatever it is that you want to share with us right now.
So well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for having me on your show, and thank you for everybody that tuned in and engaged in conversations with me. As you can tell from my content, I always go into a conversation with the intention not just to teach, but also to learn. And I also learned a great deal in the time that I've spent with you today. Anybody can continue the conversation with me by following me on Instagram or TikTok at @that_Semite. Follow content on YouTube at Unpacked. You can see me hosting content there as well. In terms of a final message, I'll leave it with the very popular Israeli slogan that if you will it, it is no dream. And so I know things can be are so dark right now, so painful, and it's so difficult to see past this fog of war into that horizon. But if we will it, it is no dream.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Yirmiyahu. Take care. Bye.
After hearing all that, you might be left wondering, what can I do? How can I help? Well, this is why I created a nonprofit called Free Hearts, Free Minds. We are the only organization dedicated exclusively to helping these free thinkers. We empower them with our programs and supportive community, lifting them up so they can heal, speak out, and begin to make positive changes, not just in their own lives, but within the broader community around them. If this is a cause that resonates with you and you want to make a difference, one way to do that is by donating to Free Hearts, Free Minds. Because not enough people care about this cause, we need people like you to help fuel this change. You can donate via our website, freeheartsfreeminds.com. Thank you. Every dollar you donate makes a difference.